Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Speedy Live Net Zero 23. Speedy Hire's very first virtual conference event, and we're coming to you live from the Speedy studio here in the wonderful city of Leeds. A city that I know very well, actually, because from 2007 to 2011, I was a fresh-faced student up here. But it is safe to say, though, that since then, it has undergone a huge transition through what has been a significant investment in construction and infrastructure to become one of the UK's most vibrant and contemporary business hubs, as well as a place to live. So, I'm Sam Quirk, and I'll be hosting the conference today as we discuss all things net zero. Today promises to be an exciting, dynamic and interactive event as we leave no stone unturned when it comes to sustainability. It will dive into Speedy's ambitious decade to deliver strategy and aim to create solutions to the challenges that the industry faces on sustainability, as well as the opportunities and successes it can present. We'll be hearing and learning from a range of leading ESG experts from the Speedy business, some of Speedy's partners, and views from outside the industry. So that's why this afternoon's session is exclusive for all of you who are all integral to Speedy's journey to achieving their goal of reaching net zero by 2040 and hopefully inspiring others as well, because not only in business but also on a personal level too, to make a change. As I said before, we're going to dive into Speedy Hire's very own ambitious ESG strategy, which they call a decade to deliver. It outlines what we will do in the next 10 years and how it will affect the next 100. Decade to Deliver is a wide-reaching ESG plan for Speedy Hire to become a net zero business by 2040, 10 years ahead of the government's target. Speedy Hire intend to achieve this through a range of long-term initiatives, from developing innovative technology and site solutions for customers, to designing a low-carbon property estate led by the blueprint of its flagship Net Zero Innovation Centre that you can see on this screen behind me. Looks amazing, doesn't it? We'll be hearing and learning from a range of leading ESG experts from Speedy Hire Business, their partners, and views from outside the industry. But as we know, global warming dominates the headlines more and more as the years and months go by, whether it's individuals fighting for change or extreme weather conditions across the globe. And it's safe to say that it is here and it will only gain greater momentum and the impact of our lives on a regular basis. So with that in mind, sustainability and social change are crucial to creating a better world when it comes to protecting our environment, both from a professional and a personal point of view. Making a change as well, however small or large it is, should not be confined to just what we do in business, as it touches and affects us in a multitude of different ways. And for me personally, since having children who are now 1.5 and 2.5, so still very tiny, I'm not ashamed to say previously I wouldn't be concerned, but actually now I have become a lot more conscious to what type of world that they will grow up in. Some things I will have no control of, whether it's who they fall in love with. Some things I will, and some things I can't change directly, but I know that the tiny things that I do on a daily basis could change things for the greater good. So for example, sustainability. Whether it's teaching the children what goes in the recycling, something they love to do at the moment, by the way, or whether it's me taking the train or the tube where possible, or looking to invest in solar panels and changing my car to an electric. And also one of the things which I've just started doing, putting the washing on at 20 degrees. And yes, it does clean the clothes just the same as if I was washing it at 40. So for me, my motivation is my kids and the world that I leave behind. For others, it may be something different. But when you hear and see others taking action as well, it also helps inspire change. Which leads me on to my next speaker, Mike Barry, a former Director of Sustainable Business at Marks & Spencer. But before I hand over to Mike, I want to bring your attention to the Q&A panel down the right-hand side of your screen. There it is. Hopefully that is the right side. Today, we'll be using this to enable you all to ask questions, whatever you may have, however big or small, whether you think it's silly. No question is a silly question. We want you to get them in and we'll try and answer as many as we can after the presentation, or even before we finish here today. As well as any questions that you may have, our speakers will also be using this facility to get you involved in a conversation with any live polls, and we'll also have a SWOT analysis as well later on today. And also you can join in on social media. Use the hashtag SpeedyLive. And of course, the real value from this session will rely on your interaction, so please do and get involved. We'd love you to say and see as much as possible, because today is all about learning, understanding, questioning and hearing your views. So enough from me, let's get started. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest, Mike Barry, former Director of Sustainable Business at Marks & Spencer. Over to you, Mike.
Sam, thank you. Delighted to be with you today. As I say, I'm Mike, 20 years at Marks & Spencer leading the sustainability journey there. And that's an instructive story in itself. I was recruited back in 2000 by the Chief Financial Officer, a lady called Alison Reed, as a very junior environment manager. It seemed really odd that the CFO would recruit me. Met her the first day and she said, Mike, a little confession to make. No one at the top of the business really gives a monkeys about the environment at the moment. I do, but it's not my responsibility as CFO. I've smuggled you into the business to be my executive financial assistant. Now, clearly you know nothing about finance, son, keep away from me books. But get out of my office and sort the green stuff out. And that's where it started. No line manager, no budget, build a little guerrilla army for change. Now, with time, M&S became one of the world's leading companies in this spaces. But right at the beginning, it was, something that the business really struggled to compute what it needed to do. So that's where I start the conversation with you today. Because over the last 20 years, I've worked really hard at M&S to drive change. But I've got to face into it. All I've really done is help Marks & Spencer be a slightly less business than it might have been. And I'd contend that many of you on this call have also been through something similar as well. We've done incrementalism, not transformation. And that's what I want to share with you today, why we need to transform our business models for the future. Just creeping along, becoming 1% less bad each year in terms of energy use simply doesn't cut the mustard. And I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk about the science that says that transformation is urgent. I'm going to talk about how that transformation has started to happen. Very early days, it's messy, it's ugly, but transformation has started out there. And then thirdly, how can we drive transformation forward at the pace and scale that we require? And I'm going to be really focused, not on numbers, not on sort of reports and life cycle assessments, but on people. Because transformation, whether it's been about health and safety in the past, whether it's been about quality, whether it's been about digital now, it's driven because people engage with it. As citizens, as colleagues, as voters, we have to take people with us. And I don't think we're doing that at this moment in time. So let me start with the challenge. Let me just sort of gallop through a little bit of science. I'm going to show you 4 slides now very, very briefly. And I just want you to look at the shape of the slides. It tells us what's happened over the last 100 years on 4 key aspects of our lives. And again, the first one was very clear. The economy, in the last 40 or 50 years, the economy's absolutely taken off across the world, which has been great for us as business leaders. We've all prospered off the back of that. That in turn has been driven by consumption. The world is today consuming about 100 billion tons of stuff, whether it's concrete, whether it's steel, whether it's cotton that goes into clothing, metals that goes into devices, it's stuff. Less than 7% of that is recycled, let alone used in a circular way. So again, in the last 50 years, our use of resources on the planet has taken off. And so is our use of fossil fuels. We're now using about 100 million barrels of oil every day to fuel the economy. And again, you can see the rapid rise of the last 40, 50 years in fossil fuel use. And of course, at the end of all that, that's pumping more and more CO2 into the atmosphere. And there might be a lot of complications in the wide world about how we respond to the climate crisis. But the basic science of climate change is GCSE stuff. It's very, very simple. CO2 put into the atmosphere, it acts like a little bit of a blanket. The more CO2 up there, the more of the solar radiation that comes down from the sun every day to hit the earth stays with us. And the world starts to warm up. And again, I'll just unfold in a moment why that's so existential for us going forward. But again, just link those things together. The economy's growing, consumption's growing, fossil fuel demand has gone up, and so CO2 in the atmosphere. It's very, very simple. So let me go, having looked at the last 100 years, let's pop back over 800,000 years, because a lot of people will say to me, Mike, CO2 in the atmosphere, it's always varied. And of course it has. Over all the planetary history, 4 billion years, the world of CO2 has gone up and down every few 100,000 years. And we can see that from this sort of graph that we have in front of us. It's showing how things are constantly cycling naturally. But look right on that extreme right. Look how fast CO2 levels are rising in the atmosphere in the last 50, 60, 70 years, driven by the four graphs I've just spoken about. Rising economic activity, more and more fossil fuel use, more and more consumption of resources. We've never seen anything like it. Not in millions of years have we seen the pace of change in terms of CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And of course, that's more than just a scientific theory. That's actually driving really significant change in our lives. The world has warmed by about 1.1 degrees C so far compared to pre-industrial levels when we started pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. And I'll come to why that's so important in a minute. But if you look what's happened this summer, devastating floods in a desert community, Libya, killing 10,000 people. The island of Rhodes, the holiday island that so many of you might have visited, stricken by wildfires, causing the emergency evacuations of holidaymakers and people who live there. And in Hawaii, a town of 23,000 people wiped out. 100 people died in a few hours, driven by extreme wildfires. And of course, across our wet little island here, nothing quite that extreme, but it's becoming ever harder to manage sewage discharges into rivers, flood events across the infrastructure we all rely on to get around and live our lives. It's becoming harder and harder to do. That's just 1.1 degrees C of heating. Now, people will often say to me, Mike, 1.1 degrees, why does that really matter? That's the temperature difference between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock this morning. Well, I'm talking about global averages. This is the temperature of the planet across 17,000 data points all through the year. And I want to give you a little bit of context to a world that's heated by 1.1 and is probably going to heat by 2.5 to 3 degrees C by the end of this century. Why does that matter? Well, again, I'm going to put us back in that time machine. I'm going to take us back 23,000 years back to the last ice age. Where we're stood in recording this in northern Britain was under 1,000 metres of ice. A kilometre of ice was there. It was an ice sheet right above our heads. How much colder was the world on average then? 10 degrees, 15, 20, 25 degrees, you might think. It was actually 5 to 6 degrees colder was enough to trigger an ice age that covered the north of Britain in an ice sheet a kilometre deep. So when I talk a world that's going to be about 2.5 to 3 degrees hotter in the other direction, that is existential. Partly because the world back in 23,000 years ago, the total global population was 150,000 people, the same as Norwich today. Today we've got over 8 billion people crammed onto this planet, and we're not getting on well, particularly well together at this moment in time. We're heading for 9 billion, maybe even 10 billion on the planet. So if we heat it 3 degrees hotter in the other direction, it will be off the scale in terms of the turmoil, in terms of the economy and society as well. Just remember that, 5 degrees colder, 1,000 metres of ice. And I want to finish the science just by the fact challenging us to think out of the box, because we often assume that the future is a linear progression of today. A little bit more CO2, a little bit more flooding, a little bit more drought. We'll find a way of coping with that. Well, the last 2 or 3 years, we've started to see some quite frightening wider statistics that said the future is not linear. And this is just 2 little data points that have emerged this year. On the left, you can sort of see the world of Antarctic sea ice extent. And on the right, it's global temperatures in the ocean. And the oceans are absorbing a lot of the excess heat that we're generating at the planet at the moment, almost suppressing the climate change impacts that are going to come. But let's just look at that Antarctic sea ice extent. We've often talked about the North Pole melting, which is bad. But the ice there floats on the surface of the ocean. As it melts, it doesn't add to sea level rise. It causes other problems up there, but it doesn't increase the level of the sea. The Antarctic, the ice is all on land, or much of it is on land. So as it melts, it increases levels of sea around the world, and billions of people will live within 5 or 10 metres of the surface of the sea. Now, this summer we saw an 11% reduction in the amount of Antarctic sea ice coverage, 11%. That's staggering. You know, normally we talk about 0.1% or 0.2%. 11% loss because the ocean is getting hotter and melting all that ice beneath the South Pole from below. Why does that matter? Well, let me just put in context what 11% means. Many of you back in 2008 probably saw Usain Bolt win the Chinese in the gold medal in the Olympics in Beijing. Amazing performance, one of the great sporting achievements in history. blasting over that line. That 9.58 seconds he said, an 11% improvement on that would have put somebody 11 metres ahead of Usain Bolt going over the finishing line. That's 11% in context. So when we talk about the reduction in the amount of ice out there that's melting into the ocean, rising sea levels, that's staggering. So here endeth the science part of this. This is just a warning to us all. It's heading in the wrong direction. This is going to be existential for our society and our economy going into the future. And I want to turn to, if that's what's happening, how do we transform? How do we shift from this mindset of being 1% less bad each year to genuinely transforming our entire approach to how we do business? Many of us have committed to become net zero by 2040 or 2050, 20 or 30 years from now. Net zero is absolutely demanding. It's a 90% reduction, 95% reduction in today's carbon emissions, not just for what we call scope 1 and 2, your own operations, but scope 3, that extended value chain of suppliers and business partners and how we reduce their emissions as well. 90% reduction. That's not about incrementalism, that's about transforming how you do business. So let's think about where we stand today. We stand at the end of a cliff edge of today's high carbon economy. We're about to take society and the economy off that cliff edge. On the other end of the side of the gorge, there is a low carbon, better future if we can get to it. We need to build a bridge from where we are today to where we need to get to in the future. And let me just sort of explain what I mean by that. On the left-hand side is the challenge that we have on today's economy. More regulation, rising costs of carbon taxes, energy costs, investor questions, customers looking for solutions from us, colleagues, particularly younger colleagues, wanting to work for a business committed to doing the right thing in this space. So we're starting to see pressures emerge on the way that we traditionally do business. But they're imprecise, they're imperfect, they're not compelling enough to get a lot of us off our backsides and working to build that bridge to the other side of the gorge. On the right-hand side, what I'm looking at then is the new economy that's emerging. We've started to see it in the power sector, the shift from oil and gas, coal, to wind, solar, battery storage, etc. Again, very, very complex. The oil, high carbon economies, the oil and gas industry fight against it. Of course they do, they're a vested interest. But wherever we've started to put it in place, we've seen costs come down, we've seen greater security of supply in a conflict-ridden world. The car industry as well. We start to see the shift from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle. And again, we have big debates, big discussions, don't we, about the pace of change, but it's inevitable. By 2030, 2040, a significant amount of vehicles moving around will be electric. It's not without its challenges, but it's going to happen. And the same will happen in the food sector. The food sector, ironically, is one of the most polluting on the planet. It's not just the oil and gas industry, but 33% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the food sector. And we have to reduce those emissions from the way we produce food and the way we consume it. But ironically as well, it's uniquely vulnerable to the problems it's causing. All that extreme weather, extreme rain, heat, drought, etc., is reducing crop yields at a time when the global population is going up. So we have to find a very different way of producing food in the future, and it's beginning. Same with fashion. We consume 130 billion pieces of clothing and footwear every year. We're heading for 200 billion at this rate. Again, a huge amount of embedded resource, much of it used wastefully, worn once on Instagram, thrown away. Crazy world of fast fashion. And again, I'm starting to see solutions emerge around, for example, resale platforms. And right through to the world of infrastructure that many of you represent. How do we make infrastructure resilient to the extreme weather events that will inevitably happen, even if we reduce emissions? But also, how do we make it more human-centric? How do we make it serve people rather than just be planted into their lives and their communities? And in the middle is the bridge. And they're the 5 things I'm going to focus on in a minute, because they're the 5 practical steps we need to take to bridge the gap from high carbon to low carbon. So that's the landscape that we've got. We're starting to see some pressure on today. We're starting to see a new economy emerge. And crucially, we're starting to understand how to get from one to the other. And of course, we're starting to see some certain industries go through the transition. And again, I've talked about a couple of them. I've talked about electric vehicles and renewables. Again, in the world of infrastructure, we're starting to see smart cities emerge, better ways of producing buildings. They're better for carbon, better for resource use, better for the people who live in them and use them as well. And the world of food, let me just finish off with that, because this is just the scale of change we're going to see. You've probably heard that the meat-based diet is very impactful. in terms of animal welfare, in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of pollution. We want people to eat less meat. It's very complex, very emotional. We've got to find ways of taking people on that journey. I'll touch on that in a moment. But lurking out there is something called cultivated meat, grown in a laboratory, 99% less impact on the environment, clearly no impact on animals. Basically, you need the stem cells of 50 cows to feed the world on cultivated meat. But at the moment, it costs too much. Now, with time, just like with wind and electric car batteries, the price will come down and down and down and down. By the mid-2030s, it will be cheaper than conventional meat, with all the additional benefits as well. Now, that's not to say that people will rush out to engage with cultivated meat. There's a yuck factor. Who controls it? What's it mean for farmers? There are so many bumps in the road to get there, but the technology is being driven forward. And this is not just happening at a corporate scale. As much as the world is fighting amongst itself, partly to protect the high carbon oil and gas industries of today, partly about lots of other things, there's a new battle emerging between nations, which is to capture the upside of green growth. We've started to see it with China as being super smart on this. It controls much of the world's solar panel production, electric battery production, wind turbine production. We've been slow to respond in the West, but now Biden, the States with the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Union, are coming out with ambitious plans to try and outcompete China to capture that green growth. You know, I sat with a car company's leadership team about 8 years ago, one of the world's biggest car companies, and I said to them, Tesla, worth $50 billion at the US at the time, is it a threat to you? They turned around and laughed at me and said, Mike, the future's lean diesel. And now that car company is struggling to respond to the challenge of electrification because it was slow to respond. But not just at a corporate level. Germany and Japan, that dominated the 20th century of car production, have been slow to respond as well. China sped past them. It had no car export industry. It saw electrification as an opportunity. It's now becoming the dominant place in the world for producing electric cars, the cars of the future. Those that are producing diesel and petrol, Japan and Germany, struggling a little bit. So again, we can start to see the tectonic plates shifting around us, even though we're individual businesses of the economy as well. So, second point, the transformation has started. It's ugly, it's messy. My point to you is do not be complacent. It's very easy to be focused on the short-term headwinds of today, which we'll touch on in a moment, about why you just need to keep it careful, be cautious, don't bet the farm, just move forward 1% at a time. But I'm warning you now that beneath you plates are shifting and you need to be looking 3 to 5 years out to understand where your company and your sector needs to be. So let's turn now to the final part of the presentation, which is what are you going to do to get from one side of the gorge to the other? And traditionally, people now would say, well, OK, Mike, I'll commit a bit more to energy efficiency. I'll produce a bigger report. I'll do some life cycle assessments. I'll give my environment manager a little bit more of a budget. No, that's incrementalism. I'm talking about transformation. And as I've already said, transformation only happens when people come with you for the ride. So I'm going to put 5 propositions in front of you that are utterly people-centric about delivering a low-carbon transformative future. And I'm going to start by saying something quite controversial. I've just talked about the climate crisis, how existential it is, but I'm also going to say we talk about it too much. There's more to the planet than just carbon. And again, I'll touch on in a moment about other environmental aspects, but also social ones as well. Because if we can reduce our use of resources, use them in a more circular way, that 100 billion I was talking about, we save carbon as well. All the mining and drilling of extracting new materials is reduced because we keep using materials. I'm seeing people like Apple increasingly using recycled metals, valuable metals in their phones, rather than getting virgin material in at great cost and great carbon impact as well. We talked about the resale platforms emerging. I'm seeing IKEA start to work to encourage people to bring old furniture back, to repurpose it, resell it as well. So that circular economy is starting to emerge. It's too slow, but it is starting to emerge. Good for pollution, good for resources, good for carbon. The second thing I'm seeing out there is, well, let's protect nature. We need to protect nature for nature's sake. We're destroying biodiversity. We're destroying forests. We're destroying oceans and rivers. Crazy. But again, if we can keep them clean, they lock up carbon, they store carbon, they take it out of the atmosphere for us. It reduces the problem we've got in terms of reducing our actual carbon emissions. And again, I'm seeing people like Timberland commit to only using sustainably sourced natural raw materials in the future. Walmart, the world's biggest food retailer, commit to protect 50 million acres of land around the world, working with hundreds of thousands of farmers in Middle America to farm regeneratively, locking carbon up in soil by looking after the soil. That's brilliant. But the real thing I want you to take away from this slide is people. And we had a very heated debate this summer around the Uxbridge by-election. People felt the ultra-low emission zone that was being put in place, mainly for air pollution reasons rather than carbon, but they felt it was being imposed upon them. The poorest sections of society were being forced to give up their old, relatively dirty cars, something the middle class can afford to do, but we're just placing the burden on the poorest sections of society. Unless we can communicate to people the benefit, every section of society, of why we're changing, we'll struggle to take society with us and we'll have these pushbacks. And I want to use just one practical example of a company that's starting to solve this. And that's the fast-moving consumer goods business, Reckitt. Big global business, you walk into a supermarket, see many of their cleaning products out there. They've got a global net zero plan. Bravo, it's brilliant, really, really good. But they've also got a really significant production facility, an R&D facility in Hull. And Hull, has seen better times economically. It's been a proud city, but under huge challenge now in terms of the economy. What Reckitt have said is we're going to bring Hull together to become net zero. Sports clubs, councils, the health system, the education system, all working together to make Hull net zero, creating better green jobs for the future, for people today and into the future, but also in terms of cleaner streets, cleaner air, cleaner rivers. And that's the way that we've got to localise action as businesses so that everybody can see the benefit of participation. And the other aspect of looking at beyond carbon is that if we just have a carbon lens, we're going to make lots of mistakes. And I'm just going to pick out 3 problems here that we need to sort of face into. As we dash for electrification of cars, we need these metals that produce many in Central Africa, very sort of failed states, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Who's producing them? Children often, people abused in terms of human rights abuse. We're getting the metals to make our cars greener, but what human cost? Biofuels. We want biofuels to displace the use of oil and fossil fuels from vehicles, particularly from aeroplanes now. We want something called sustainable aviation fuels. That's good. There's no other way really to decarbonise air travel. Let's start to use sustainable aviation fuels made from biomaterials. But we're now starting to compete between the use of biomaterials for fuels with the food system. 44% of all corn grown in America never reaches the human mouth. It goes into a fuel tank. That drives up the price of corn, which impacts the food system and, again, the lives of many of the poorest people on the planet. And again, another great perversity. Wind turbine blades. We're heading by 2050 to have something like 40 million wind turbine blades left in landfills because they've not been designed at the end of their life to be recycled. Same with solar panels, 70 million. Again, we've not had circular thinking. We need these solutions, but we need them to be done in a way that's good for every aspect of the environment and for people as well. So that's proposition number 1. In thinking about solving the climate crisis, let's put people at the heart of it, and let's not have perverse secondary impacts as well. The second thing I want to talk about is how we engage people in making better choices. Now, I appreciate many of you on this call today will be from a B2B business model. It's professionals selling to professionals. But if I'm going to just stretch your thinking a little bit by talking about the consumer marketplace. And again, I just want to reflect on where people's heads are at this. Now, to save you the time, I've looked at 200 different studies from around the world on consumers thinking on sustainability, sustainable consumption. And we keep coming back to the same basic numbers that I've got in front of you here. 10% of us are passionately green. Much of our lives, much of our consumption decisions are based around green thinking, but it's just 10%. The other extreme, 20% of people not engaged whatsoever. Not because they're against it, but again, poorest sections of society got other priorities, just surviving day to day, week to week. You can't ask them to think about the Arctic and the Amazon when they're just getting by. But there are 2 groups in the middle that really matter. 35% of people are light green. They want great cars, they want great holidays, great food, great clothing, but they do want them to be increasingly more sustainable. I talked about Tesla, one of the reasons it took off, not just because it's a green car, but because it's also aspirational and high performance. So we've got to find ways to give people what they want in terms of personal attributes, but we've got to do it as well in a fundamentally greener way. And then that other group of 35% you can see, utterly focused around locality. It's my whole story. Love what you're doing to save the planet, but I live in Hull. What are you doing for us here? What we need to do is show people by acting at a local level, we can make a difference in their lives here and now, not in 20 or 30 years' time as well. So that's just a basic, very quick skim as to where people's heads are at. And I just want to sort of take you for one slide into what's happening in the marketplace, because again, it's early days, but I'm starting to see a focus on how to engage people in making better choices. Now, in the old paradigm, we would have said, okay, you know, Marks and Spencer sells 40,000 unique products, Tesco's 100,000, Walmart 1 million, Amazon 12 million. We'll put a carbon label on everything and just say to people, make a decision, your choice, high carbon, low carbon. You can't do that. You don't have a PhD in science, you've got 10 minutes in the shop, the kids are crying, you just want to get out. You ain't going to be looking at a label on everything. But that's the beginning. So I'm starting to see some supermarkets say, to be on my shelf in the future, supplier, you've got to cut your carbon by 50%. You walk into a supermarket in the future, every product is 50% less carbon. You don't have to think about it, you just shop with that supermarket. It's been done for you. You might find poor performing suppliers evicted from the shelves because they can't keep up. You don't have access to the marketplace, you have no business. It concentrates minds. I'm also seeing people out there using meta labels, bringing together people like Amazon, Walmart, the world's biggest retailers, saying lots of complications out there. We're just going to put a stamp of approval on this product to say we've looked at the detail, the science, the numbers and the certification systems, and we endorse this product. Think Intel inside. You don't have to think beyond one logo saying it's good. There's something called B Corp, brilliant. Thousands of companies now becoming B Corp. I've got an example of Chloe, the luxury business here. An exhaustive, rigorous understanding of your commitment to the environment and society. All I have to know is that that company is a B Corp. I don't need to look at the detail of its individual products because overall that company is well run. Again, a shorthand simplification to make choices. Then there's something called How Good, but also companies called Food Steps, Mondra, that are starting to enable digital platforms to make decision making easy. So let's imagine you go to a supermarket online, there's 100,000 products online, and you're worried about something called palm oil, associated with deforestation on the other side of the world. That's bad. You don't want to see it in your basket, but you don't want to look at 7,336 different products to try and find palm oil in them. What How Good does is it says, we know where the palm oil is in every individual product. If you say don't want palm oil or single-use plastic or high carbon products, we just sweep it away from your eye line. You shop a low carbon palm oil free basket if that's what you want. And the final example up there, some of the sort of credit card companies, the financial sort of platforms are starting to give you carbon trackers to allow you to track what you're spending in every part of the economy, its carbon implications, and offer you tips and ideas as to how to make better choices. So again, the word I want you to take away from all of this, let's simplify sustainable consumption for people. The third story is all about culture. Again, one of the things we achieved at Marks and Spencer was to make our sustainability plan, Plan A, because there is no Plan B for the one planet we've got, relevant to everybody, to all 83,000 colleagues. And here are just some things that we learned. It's all about every touch point in their working life, lots of small things laddering up so that you understand how to make a difference in everything you do. So whether you're working on salt reduction in food, better packaging, better high streets in Hull, or better clothing factories in Bangladesh, it all just ladders up to being part of Plan A. You've got to empower colleagues to have a point of view. There were so many daft things we did from the centre. We launched Plan A back in 2007 and somebody rang me up 2 or 3 months later from our Barnsley store and said, Mike, every morning we print out a colour document telling us our great detail, our sales in Barnsley store. It's sort of useful, but it's dozens and dozens of pages. I get a black and white printout straight afterwards, 2 pages. That's the one I use. Colour goes in the bin. Everybody said the same. We turned it off overnight. 1,000 shops stopped printing out dozens and dozens of colour documents every morning. Saved the business 130 grand overnight. Simple. Because somebody had the courage and the belief that they could put their hand up in the Barnsley store and say, stop. So again, really important that you listen to the shop floor. The next thing is all about ownership. Again, I led a team of 10 people out of 83,000 at M&S. I don't buy fruit and veg and clothing. I don't run marketing campaigns. I don't run supply chains. I don't build buildings. My colleagues who did a brilliant job at integrating a more sustainable way of working into how they did things. There was governance, there's a remuneration link. It drove a behaviour across the entire organisation as well. So it really matters to build an enabling culture. And let me just sort of turn now into the fourth and penultimate thought now, which is about what accelerates change. And I just want to touch on three things again I learned at M&S. The first is the business case. The first 10 years of our plan, we saved the business £750 million net from becoming more eco-efficient. Less waste, less energy use, less fuel use, 21 million pounds a year off the electricity bill at a time of cheap electricity, so much more now. Right through to coat hangers. M&S was giving out 200 million plastic coat hangers a year with clothing it sold automatically. You didn't ask for it, but you got it. That was crazy. Bad for the environment, all that plastic, and the business saved, by stopping it, the business saved £6 million a year. So all that adds up to savings, as well as motivation for a business going through a lot of change, resilience in supply chains, and preparing for sort of new product areas in the future. The second thing I learned was about agile innovation. Taking 5 shops, 5 factories, suppliers' factories and 20 farms, and piling all the green and eco-innovation into them. And what we found very rapidly is a third of things were brilliant, roll them out everywhere, a third were rubbish in the bin, and a third needed tweaking within those environments for 6-12 months before we could roll them out more extensively. And the final thing I learned was about digitisation. M&S sells about 3 billion items a year, a pair of shoes, a ready meal, a bottle of wine. I was trying to track and trace and improve all that with a spreadsheet. With a pen, a paper, may as well have been an abacus. Crazy. Grey hair was the outcome. Now in a world of machine learning, AI, remote sensing, big data, we can start to get our arms around these staggering data sets to track, to trace and improve everything we do. Remember my How Good story about making sure that every product has got a data set around it. That's the future. Put data and digital at the heart of everything you do. So let me just finish by being, again, very humble. Lots of big businesses around the world have committed to being green. That's fantastic. But none of them can do it on their own. It's just too hard. And again, I'm seeing increasingly businesses working both with their value chains and with the wider sector. So I'm seeing people like Walmart create platforms where people can share learning and experience to educate and uplift. I'm seeing people out there like HSBC working with different businesses to give preferential financing to suppliers who are doing the greener thing. So real support that you need to do for your suppliers. You can't just write to them and say, do this green thing for me, sort it out. You have to actively help them transform. 90% less carbon for you and for them is not something that can be just done on the back of a fag packet on a Friday afternoon. You have to actively support them for the next 10 years. And of course, with your sector, again, I use the example of the UK Green Business Council. We could pick any different sector. 70% of what a typical business needs to do to transform on sustainability is done in partnership with others. You cannot do it on your own. So that's a very human gallop through what we need to do as businesses to transform, put people at the heart of what we do. But I want to sort of finish on exactly the same note for you as individuals. We come to business and we talk about business cases and processes and systems when we walk into our office on a Monday morning. And we leave behind the humanity of us as individuals. Be really clear that the world that our children or our neighbours' children or our godchildren, if we might be an aunt or an uncle, they're all going to be growing up in 20, 30, 40 years' time in a climate disrupted world unless we take this seriously. And yet we as business leaders are creeping along incrementally. And I know you've all got different roles within your organisation. I want you to feel empowered. I want you to feel inspired that you can step forward as a human being, of course with your head thinking about this, but also with the passion of the heart to drive the change we need. And even if you're not looking through the lens of kids in the future, you're all sufficiently young to have 30, 40, 50 years left on this planet as well. You're going to be living through this with us all as well. So let me finish there. That's been a canter through the science of why we need to transform, the fact that the transformation is starting to happen, albeit messily, and 5 steps where we can put people at the heart of the transformation. The businesses that win in the future are human-centric in terms of what they do. Thank you very much.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for that. It really was an interesting listen, and we hope you enjoyed that fantastic keynote as well.